My name's Greg Braden, and I'd like to welcome you to this very special presentation of Missing Links, the deep truth of our origin, history, destiny, and fate. In our last episode, we discovered that the key to the thinking that will guide us through our time of extremes is found in the timeless wisdom that our ancestors asked themselves in their time, and that science is asking today. The question is simply this: who are we? Well, new discoveries are changing our answer. And as they do, they're changing the way we think of ourselves and the world. Today, let's zero in on some of those discoveries and what they mean in our lives. When I was in school back in the 1960s and 70s, I was taught that the fundamental essence of matter looked like this. It looks like an atom. And the atom was a mechanical atom. It was little things moving around the thing, electrons moving around the nucleus. Well, today, the atom no longer looks like little things moving around the thing. It looks like this. There are fields within fields within fields, pulsing fields of energy. This is one of the ways that our thinking has changed very, very quickly. We now know that everything is energy. We now know that everything is connected. We now know that when we look into the universe, for example, that the stars that we're seeing that appear to be separate from one another aren't really separate at all. In this image that you're seeing, this is from the Hubble Space Telescope. It is an optical telescope. It looks at the universe much the way you and I would look through our eyes, and when it sees the stars and the galaxies, it sees them as separate from one another optically. Now, I'm going to share with you another image from another telescope. The image that you're seeing right now is from the Chandra Space Telescope. It is not an optical telescope. It senses energy. We're looking at the same place in space, but look how different this looks. All of a sudden, those stars and galaxies, they're no longer separate from one another. They're all connected. And one of the things I find really fascinating about this connection is that we have a sense that it's almost like a net or a web. Interestingly enough, our indigenous ancestors have always told us that we live in the web of creation. In the Hopi tradition, for example, when Spider Grandmother first emerged into this world, she wove the web of creation so that her children could live their lives. Or in the Hindu traditions, the great god Indra wove the web of creation. At the intersection of each place in the web, Indra put a glittering jewel of light that became the planets and the stars that we see in our night sky. So these ways of thinking, they're not scientific, but these are the ways that our ancestors made sense of what they saw in their world, and this is where much of what science is revealing today parallels those traditions. We definitely are seeing a web-like presence. When we think about one another, we've been taught that we're separate from one another, that we're separate from the world around us, and that what we do in our bodies, in our thoughts, feelings, and emotions has very little influence on anything beyond our own physical body, if that. But the new discoveries are telling us that's not true at all. The new discoveries are showing us that we are deeply connected, and in some ways the connection arises from fields of energy that we've only begun to understand in the late part of the 20th and now the early 21st century. The heart, for example. We now know around every human heart there's a field of energy. Now, this is a field that we can measure with conventional equipment. You can go to the hardware store and build your own detector if you know what you're looking for. So this energy, it's not the prana, it's not the aura, it's not the chakra. It may be related to the prana and the aura and the chakra, but it is an electromagnetic field of energy shaped like a donut. It's called the tube torus, and it extends between 5 and 8 feet from every human heart around us. When I asked the researchers who were working with these fields, I know that these fields are very powerful, and I said, why would they only extend to 5 to 8 feet? And the researchers said, Greg, it's a good question. They said the 5 to the 8 feet, that is the limitation of the equipment doing the measuring. They said in all probability, the field that extends around every human heart is probably an infinite field on the quantum level. an infinite field from our hearts, extending into creation. And that means that what we create in that heart field is broadcast and in some ways influences the world around us. And that's the beauty of understanding the science that parallels these ancient traditions. We interact with one another every day through these heart fields. The new discoveries are telling us this. The new discoveries are telling us a lot about not only our everyday lives, but our past. We've been conditioned to believe, for example, that we as humans are the product of an evolutionary process that began long ago and has gone through many iterations leading to where we find ourselves today. That's what we've been taught. We've been steeped in a story that tells us that evolution is our story. However, the new science, the best science of the 21st century, is now telling us, while evolution is a fact for some forms of life, that the theory breaks down when it comes to humans. Something else is happening. So all of these discoveries that I am sharing with you right now, they're all examples of where new discoveries are, in fact, changing the story of the way we answer the question, who am I? We know that we are connected and not separate. We know that we are energetic beings and that we influence the world around us through that energy. So what I'd like to do right now is zero in on one place in this conversation, to zero in on one of these places where we're taught to think about our past in a way that no longer works, and that is with civilization itself. When I was in school back in the 60s and 70s, I think many of you, when you were in school, or if you have young people in school today, we have been taught, we've been steeped in the belief that civilization began about 5,000, maybe 5,500 years ago with ancient Sumeria. And from that point in time, there has been a linear progression to the point where we are today. And we're taught that we are the most sophisticated civilization that has ever graced the face of the earth. The problem is, the data doesn't support that story. The data doesn't support the story. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is you're seeing an image of the line of history, the timeline of history that was being used when I was in school. And I asked my history professor, I said, what happened to the left of Sumeria? What happened before that 5,500 years? And I remember my professor said to me something very powerful. It triggered something within me. He said, don't worry about anything to the left. He said, that's not important. He said, history began, civilization began 5,000 years ago. And I said, what? I said, you mean we don't know what happened before that? I said, that's the place for me. That's where I want to be. That's where I want to look. And I have spent much of my adult life exploring the new archaeological discoveries that are now overturning these ideas of history and civilization and where we began. So if you will look to this chart, what you're seeing is the timeline of what we have been led to believe. You see ancient Sumeria, ancient Egypt, and everything, the Maya, the Inca, the Aztec, the Olmec, the Toltec, everything is more recent than that. Greece and Rome, as old as they feel to us, they are all more recent. I have personally had the opportunity now to document some of the new discoveries that are telling us that civilization is much, much older. For example, what you're seeing right now, this is an image of me in 2010 documenting a new site in northern Peru. And this site is rocking the world of history, of archaeology, because it is now documented to be the single oldest technologically advanced civilization in all of the Americas. In all of the Americas, it's older than the Inca, than the Aztec, than the Olmec, than the Toltec. It's older than anything in Mexico, older than anything in North America. It is called Caral. Caral, C-A-R-A-L, Caral, Peru. Caral is a mystery to us because we've been taught that civilization began 5,000 years ago. Interestingly, that's when this one ended. Caral collapsed 5,000 years ago, and what the dating now is showing us is that it thrived for 2,000 years before that. It's 7,000 years ago. So if this were the only place where the data does not fit the traditional story, maybe we could call it an anomaly. But what's happening is there are so many anomalies that scientists and historians have set aside. And they said, well, these archaeological discoveries don't fit our story. We'll come back and look at them later. Now, there are so many discoveries to come back and look at that the discoveries are telling a new story. And that new story is what we're talking about right here. Kural was a technologically advanced civilization. It is about 150 acres, so it's a large site. 5 pyramids, 3 circular plazas like the one you're seeing in the image right now, and a tremendous amount of information in a non-written form. So they weren't using writing, but they were using symbols and geometry to tell us that they understood the cosmos and they understood their relationship to the cosmos. The astronomical markers that remain in Kural today are indicating relationships that were not even known in the Western world until the 20th century, yet this was 7,000 years ago. How did they know? Where did they get their information? So when we think about Kural, that confirmed date, 7,000 years, it's old, but it's not the oldest. Now, I know there's been a lot of controversy around the discoveries that have been made in Egypt over the years. And I've worked with some of the researchers who've done beautiful work on pushing against the mainstream history and the mainstream classrooms and the mainstream textbooks that tell us about what really happened in Egypt. And specifically, one of the best preserved places in Egypt is the Giza Plateau. This is where we find the Great Pyramid as well as the Sphinx. Well, as a geologist, I'm a degree geologist, and I've been fascinated by what has happened with the Sphinx for this reason. The traditional dating of the Sphinx has been about 4,400 to 4,500 years before present. So we're told that that is when the great pharaohs built this structure. The problem has always been that the Sphinx is constructed of material, of rock that is in situ. In other words, it's not made of blocks that were brought in from another place. It was carved out of the natural rock, out of the Mother Earth. And because of that, what we find on that rock, we know happened in that place. It didn't happen somewhere else. Well, here's where this gets really interesting. The erosion that we see on the shoulders and on the back of the Sphinx, we've been told for years that it was from wind, high amounts of wind over long periods of time. That's called aeolian erosion. Well, when geologists from Boston University, and specifically Robert Schoch, when he went in and began examining these erosion marks, what he found as a geologist, he's actually a stratigrapher and a paleontologist, I believe, are the two terms that he uses to describe his expertise. What he found is that the erosion is actually not made from wind, it's made from water. It's not aeolian, it's called fluvial erosion, made from tremendous amounts of water moving quickly over long periods of time. That's where the story of the Sphinx gets really interesting, because there has not been vast amounts of water moving quickly over long periods of time for a very, very long time. But the scientist, Robert Schoch and his team, this was their conclusion. They published this in peer-reviewed geologic journals. And the interesting thing was the geologists said, sure, it's obvious. We have no problem with this conclusion. The geologists, the historians, have a terrible problem with the conclusion, because the conclusion says the last time that kind of water was moving through Egypt, where the Great Sphinx is between 8,000 and 12,000 years ago. Now, that messes up all the history books. However, that is what the science is showing us. 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, the Sphinx would have already had to been in place, which means maybe it was built even before that for the water to begin the erosion. In his own words, I just want to share with you the words of Robert Schoch. He said, quote, "I came to the conclusion that the oldest portions of the Great Sphinx must date back to an earlier period, at least 7,000 years, and maybe as early as 9,000 years ago, to a time when the climate was very different and included more rain." So what we're talking about are anomalies in the archaeological record as we have been asked to embrace that record in the past. We're looking at evidence of advanced technological civilizations during a time we were told only primitive mud huts in primitive societies were existing. Now, there's so many of these anomalies that we could take the time to explore right now, but I'd like to cut to the chase. I want to spend a little bit of time on the oldest technologically advanced civilization that science has now agreed is a technologically advanced civilization, and they've agreed upon the dates. It's a very mysterious site. It's located in southern Turkey near the Syrian border, which makes it a very difficult place for archaeologists to get into right now because of the war that's happening there. It is called Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe. And it is a site that has been on the radar of some archaeologists for some time. Now, I'm mentioning this because in the last episode, we talked about the false assumptions of science with the inverted pyramid. One of those false assumptions was the assumption that civilization began 5,000 years ago. This is important because when we ask ourselves, who am I as an individual? Who are we collectively? And we look at where we've come from, we've been conditioned to think in that box, to go back only 5,000 years. But let me share with you what a profound and limiting effect that can have on a scientist who adheres to this kind of thinking. In the 1960s, there was an American archaeologist. He heard from villagers about this site, Göbekli Tepe, and they took him there. And he found some pottery on a hill, and he began dating this pottery. And the dates for the pottery came back so old that the scientists said they can't be right because civilization is only 5,000 years old. That is what we've all agreed upon. So even though the pottery told him something older was happening, he made a professional choice. He walked away from this site because he said it cannot possibly be as old as what the dates are now revealing. Well, it wasn't until the 1990s that a German archaeologist returned to this site. He did the same dating. The difference is he was not bound by the rigidity of the scientific thinking. He wasn't in that box, and he believed the dates. And he very famously said publicly, and he said to his crew, to his team, he said, if I don't walk away from this site right now, he said, I will spend the rest of my life excavating this site. And that is precisely what he did until he passed just a couple of years ago. So what is Göbekli Tepe? It's a mysterious site. It is believed to be a series of circular temples that are buried under the earth. Apparently, they were intentionally buried. And I say it is believed because they are still buried. Scientists are using Earth imaging radar, Earth penetrating radar, to look into the earth and see these temples. Right now, there, I believe, are 5 to 8 that have been unexcavated. They are circular temples of vertical columns. Scientists don't know who put them there, why they were there, why they were intentionally buried. But the fact that they were has preserved what has been found to such a degree that the hieroglyphs look like they were made yesterday. Some of the most magnificent images of what these hieroglyphs are all about. Some of the hieroglyphs are very mysterious and are now being linked directly to constellations and star systems that were not even acknowledged until the 20th century. So once again, we're saying, how did they know? How did these people know? Well, one of the things that I find really intriguing about Göbekli Tepe is the remains, the artifacts that have been found there. And there have been a series of images of humans that are anatomically correct, and everything is done really well with one exception. None of them have a mouth. The mouth on every one of these is non-existent. Scientists don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. We've never seen anything like that before, and because it is so consistent throughout the Göbekli Tepe site, we have to think that it has some meaning that actually will benefit us in helping to understand the site itself. So we're looking at a series of circular temples underground, buried intentionally. This is where it gets even more interesting. The burial of the sites happened about 8,000 years ago. So remember, we're taught that civilization is only 5,000 years old. This site was buried 8,000 years ago, but the dating now is pushing its origin back far beyond that. The scientific dating for Göbekli Tepe as it stands right now is between 11,300 and 11,500 years before present. It's over twice as old as what you and I were taught when we were in school and what we're teaching our young people in the classrooms and from the textbooks today. 11,3 to 11,5. Now, if we begin plugging in some of these dates from what are called the anomalous sites on the traditional timeline, I'm going to do this on your screen so you can see it. What we see, here's Caral in Peru, there is Göbekli Tepe, there is the Great Sphinx, there are other sites, Çatalhöyük, for example, another site in Turkey, or the Gulf of Khambhat in India, a fascinating site just off the shore of the Indian continent underneath 120 feet of water. So scientists say either this site was built underwater intentionally, which isn't likely, but you have to say that as a scientist, or it once was above water and became submerged when the sea levels rose. Well, that brings up a problem for history because the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age when the ice melted and the water raised the sea levels. That was 12,000 years ago. So the Gulf of Khambhat, a very mysterious site. It is huge. It is 5 miles long. It's 3 miles wide. And scientists now very interested in excavating this. The problem is it's all underwater and it adds to the complexity. So I'm just mentioning this so you can see it's not just about Caral, it's not just Göbekli Tepe or the Sphinx, but there are many sites now that don't fit this historic model. And as a geologist, I like to see what's happening on the Earth when the civilizations are happening in the way that they are. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing for you now on the chart, the blue shaded box, that is the last ice age, and it ended about 12,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe being dated to 11,500 years, that is the date that scientists have now. However, they have yet to excavate to the bottom of the site. So they believe that when they get to the bottom of Göbekli Tepe, we're going to be looking at around a 13,000-year-old archaeological site. That pushes it into the last ice age. We are now talking about a technologically advanced civilization dating back into the last ice age. So what I'd like to call your attention to is when you look at the chart, I'm drawing the red lines that represent the 5,000-year cycles that we talked about in an earlier episode. These are 5,000-year cycles. They were known by Mesoamerican traditions, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca. These are the 5,000-year cycles that were the focus of the 2012 phenomenon and the Mayan calendar. So on the chart, what you're seeing, the red line to the right, that is the most recent 5,000-year cycle completion. That was 2012. So as you go to the left, you see when it began, and interestingly, when that cycle began, the space between the beginning and the end of this 5,000-year cycle encompasses everything that we have been taught about the history of the world. What we have been led to believe is the history of the whole world forever is actually only the history within the most recent 5,000-year cycle. There was another one before that, another one before that, another one before that. And what scientists are also finding is that it is at these 5,000-year cycles when the climate changes. And that climate change is very, very similar to the climate change that we're seeing right now. It may be the trigger for the beginning of some civilizations and the end for others. As the climate changes, the way our ancestors grew their food changed, and they had to find new ways to take care of themselves and to feed the large populations for some of these sites. So now what we're looking at is we're looking at civilization in 5,000-year cycles rather than a linear event that happened once and evolved into the sophisticated state that we see today. We're looking at the beginning and the end, and the beginning and the end, and the beginning and the end of technologically advanced civilizations in the past. This opens the door to a lot of possibilities. One of the questions, for example, when scientists look at some of the most magnificent temples remaining on the earth today, Machu Picchu, for example, or if they look at the Giza Plateau and the Great Pyramid and the Great Sphinx, or they look at Göbekli Tepe, or they look at Caral, and they look at what these people knew, the cosmological knowledge, the astronomical knowledge, the ability to calculate cycles. And they say, where did this knowledge come from? The understanding of these cycles may be giving us a clue, because it's possible now that our most technologically advanced civilizations had a knowledge that was perpetuated from one civilization, and as it collapsed, remnants became the next civilization, and it collapsed, remnants became the next civilization, and in that way, we are looking at a timeline and a heritage of knowledge of the cosmos and wisdom of us, who we are and where we've come from. Now, I have to say something here. When people look at this, the idea of cycles and technologically advanced civilizations, two questions inevitably emerge. What about Lemuria? What about Atlantis? I'm sharing what I know to be true with you through the language of peer-reviewed science as we know it today. Now, my personal opinion, I believe there were advanced civilizations before. It may have been called Lemuria and Atlantis, and I think we're probably finding evidence of that. However, it is not yet accepted by science. It is not yet peer-reviewed. So I want to mention that, and this is important, because in our next episode, we'll take the exploration of our past back even further in time, to a time when modern science tells us that all that existed were the microscopic precursors of ancient amoeba. The question is, how do we explain sophisticated artifacts that we find linked to that very same point in time, to that same time in history, and the growing body of evidence that simply does not fit the traditional story of our past? I want to thank you for joining me for this program today, and be sure to tune in for our next all-new episode of Missing Links, the deep truth of our origin, history, destiny, and fate.